Good evening. This is a discussion about my third book, published in 2014, Do Ask, Do Tell. Speech is a fundamental right, being listened to is a privilege, and that's actually a hardbound copy that is available. And what I'm presenting is a professional interview done by a Jesse Crowley in from England, and I'm going to show you um, pieces of it, about 6 segments of it, and um, that'll be that. And if I will give you the link to the entire video, which is in my playlist in the description, and the entire video is 53 minutes. And I'll pick out a few sections just to give you a feel for what I said here. So let's get on with it. That's the playlist. And I go to here. Parents were reasonably stable, and I start right here. Only child. My parents were reasonably stable and well off. My father was a manufacturer's representative for a
It's for
glass
Talking
company.
Books is the
We
name of
bought
the
a
company.
house at the start of
J.T.
1950.
Crowley.
I spent 12 years in the same public school. I was sickly as a child and fell behind in physical education as to what is expected of boys. Maybe because of measles in the second grade, that might have been the reason. But I started catching up somewhat physically in high school with puberty, but I never caught up completely. And I began noticing felt attracted, interested in men that were very more masculine than I was. And I started noticing that physically, and didn't really talk about it. And then when I went away to college the first year, there were some issues with how I adapted to living in a dorm, which were quite subtle. And I was asked to leave school right after Thanksgiving at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg in the fall of 1961. Very complicated story, which is explained in the books. Then I graduated from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. in the winter of 1966. Actually had a stint at NIH as an inpatient and then worked for a year, but I still graduated in the 4 years. Went to the University of Kansas for graduate school, finished my master's in math in 1968. Actually served 2 years in the Army, although I was kind of sheltered by my education, and that's interesting. Wound up in special training and in basic training because I was behind physically still. That's interesting. And then I had a long work career in information technology and mainframe technology, which I sort of grew up along with it. Things were not as fast and as efficient in the early days as things changed a lot during my career. And then we got through Y2K and moved several times, lived in Texas, lived in New York, and lived in Texas as a gay man, came out again, that is, and survived the AIDS epidemic. That's a long story how I escaped that. I was in Texas then. Um, Came and then was laid off at the end of 2001 after 9/11, the 9/11 attacks affected my company. Went back with mother, who died in 2010, and then I've been on my own within inherited house, and then I moved into a condo. But I've been writing, blogging a lot, planning possibly there could be film possibilities for the books, and we'll talk about the theme of the book in a minute. The book in the next sections about here. Part of the content was to know what the contents of the previous book had been, particularly the first book, and how, if I was rewriting the entire thing, how I would structure the chapters. But
Talking
the
about
other
the
thing was
forward to the
this
book here.
overriding theme that I've been a lone wolf all my life, and I wasn't very sociable, and that to be heard and to get people to pay attention to you, sometimes you have to be willing to be involved with their issues and their problems and meet them where they are socially. And so that's the meaning that we have to become social creatures again in the forward. And it sort of sticks out that that's the title of the forward, but I don't really talk that much. I talk about a lot of other things in the forward besides that, the books themselves, but that is what sticks out. That's becoming more apparent that if people can express their ideas in speech a lot and debate things and just talk past each other if they don't share experiences socially. And I guess that's one of the reasons why society has become so polarized in the United States. And I think it sounds like it's pretty polarized in Europe too, in Britain.
Oh yeah.
More or less. So now to discussing chapter 2 about, which I called the virtue of maleness, not masculinity or manhood, but maleness. That's kind of an interesting title, I think. Okay, there was certain, I guess I had a soul truth. Truth, reality, you could say, is public reality, what we accept is the real world, your own private life, and then your own soul, what things you believe in your own soul that make your life work, but that you know or not how the rest of the world perceives reality, but that are important to you. And so I sort of split my sense of that into it's a small part of your world. It's not what the rest of the world sees of you. It's what you really feel. And I felt, I was behind in maleness. Essentially, I didn't develop properly as a biological male that I should have. Now that I'm willing to own that fact and own the responsibility for it, even if I didn't choose it, even if there were measles or genetics or pre-birth hormones or whatever, whatever it might have been could have led to that. There obviously something biologically must have happened. But the idea that being affiliated with a man that was more attractive and masculine than I was meant something. And I thought that affiliating with someone who was both smart and had both brains and blonde was a good thing. And there are certain things about male sexual attractiveness that are not the same. And I don't want between different races. For example, white men have more body hair than men of other races. That was significant to me, and it's very sensitive. But the fact is that affected how I perceived people because I grew up in more or less a segregated society. My high school didn't start becoming integrated until probably after I left high school. So I lived in a white world. So that was how I reacted to people.
So do you think that? So do you think that you are the person right from birth? You are given a set of genes, and whether those genes are steering you down what we call the straight way or another way.
I think there are certainly zones. I think there are probabilities, sort of like a probability distribution. I think some people, if they try hard enough, can live a straight life and have intercourse with women and produce children, even if they're not as masculine. If they get through certain things and if there's enough social pressure, because in other cultures, non-Western cultures, particularly in other parts of the world, including Russia and then China and Africa and so forth, and there's a lot of pressure on men to provide for families, and most people manage to somehow learn to do it under great pressure. A very small number of people will not be able to do it. But more people will prefer not to do it if they think their lives are self-expressive, if they simply don't have children and live according and then nurture their own soul values that they think of as their truth, even if it's not truth publicly speaking, even if it, and they'll pass. The word, the word a lot of people use is passing. It's conventional, or passing is straight, or passing is this. Now cisgender is what people talk about now, but that wasn't at the time of the book. But passing, in other words, looking, a lot of gay men, for example, are very masculine in the way they behave publicly. And so they pass. And so then some other people are not as able to do that and behave according, even in society and publicly, according to society's expectations. And they are going to have a harder time getting along. And that's what a lot of the problems today are about, particularly in the last 10 years. And that's been particularly more the case since the book was written than it was at the time I was writing it. Right after when I wrote the book,
Chapter 3 about the internet.
when I was writing the book,
broadcasts or
mostly
something.
the first book, mostly from 1994 to 1997, we didn't really have the internet working very much yet. We're starting to get email. By about 1996 into 1997, it was becoming possible for people to have their own domains and put their own writings out there for anyone to find. And search engines, even though people would try to get you to pay to have the sites indexed, search engine indexing became free. And so it turned out that in my case, that I could write essays, and then I could actually put the books online. If people didn't buy them, I could still get people to read my point of view by just putting it out on the internet. It turns out that the search engines found them very quickly. And it turns out that probably a few 100,000 people a year were coming into contact with my writing, and enough to actually know what I was talking about, probably in the hundreds of thousands a year. Even though there weren't that many copies being sold, a lot of people were finding out what I had to say. And this is particularly because of the argument I was making, which was back in the first book, that forced intimacy in a college dorm was parallel to forced intimacy in the barracks in the military 30 years later, when we were debating gays in the military in the United States, which I think in Britain happened sooner than it did in the United States.
Yes.
The Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, in fact, wouldn't be repealed until the end of 2010 or early in 2011. And it's still actually, it hasn't been unrepealed. The things that have happened here since then have been just trans. So I just thought I'd mention that to make sure there's no misunderstanding that the repeal is still in place. But it was the important thing here is that my putting it out for people to find it. And when this was an unusual issue, because it talks about forced intimacy, people being in a sex place where some people are sexually attractive and might be attracted to each other and so forth, particularly among men, and particularly in the military. That was a sensitive issue to talk about. And so I put it out there and let search engines find it. So I was able to have a big effect on particularly that issue. I think without my doing what I did, it's even possible that it wouldn't have been repealed in 2010. I actually think that's a reasonable statement. So the fact that I could do this without even having to commercialize it, without even having to sell a lot of copies, that I could use the internet to leverage what I had to say and let people find it, was a very big deal. Now, and this was new that someone could do this. And also, this was before social media algorithms that sort of started coming around after 2008, after the 2008 crisis. 2009, 2010, Facebook started and Twitter started becoming big. And then the algorithms sort of started taking off with smartphones in maybe 2011, 2012, 2013. Now, I wrote the book in 2013, and I wasn't really aware when I was writing the book how important the algorithms were going to become and how people socialize, particularly teenage girls, for the silly things that you see, you know, on TikTok and so forth. I was more serious about this, but the search engines alone, before we had social media, provided a lot of opportunity for people to learn things on their own by fishing around on the internet. It wasn't until about 2011 or 2012 that the social media algorithms really started taking over. But even without that, even with just the search engines, I was able to have a big effect. Now, some people may not like that, and they may not like the fact that I've inherited money and don't have to make a living off of it to have that kind of an effect. That's an issue. Well, no, seriously, that could be an issue.
Yeah.
It could be an ethical issue. Maybe
and of course, when you wrote the book in 2013, you were not aware of artificial intelligence.
Let's get to 3612. Talking to myself here, looking for the next extract. Yeah, AI could change a lot of things. I've really not been paying as much attention to that as maybe I should.
Okay, it's about ultimately taking care of my mother from home. Her decline
chapter
after I moved
5
back
now.
in 2003. She passed away at the end of 2010. But in terms of principles, it's about whether children should be responsible for their elderly parents. Some states have filial responsibility laws. Children can actually be forced to support their parents in some states. There was a case in Pennsylvania in 2012. I've talked about places, but the experience of being home and then seeing my mother decline and then having the caregivers come in. The last 18 months, she was very dependent. We had caregivers there all the time. They were all we got them from agencies, you know, healthcare agencies, and I'm sure they were all legal immigrants. I don't think, but that's who we depend on today for a lot of caregiving is immigrants. And this could become a real problem now, much more than it was then, of course, with what's going on.
Sure.
So that's why Chapter 5 is important, elder care.
And it is very important to everybody.
30 now. One more extract here.
It's a very fascinating story. Tell us.
Because I went through basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, which is in Columbia, and it tracks pretty much with names changed and everything. And I was writing a book then, sort of a picaresque book, where I called myself John Morchek was the name of the character. And so the other things in it are sort of based on things that happened pretty closely. But basic training was very traumatic to get it to leave graduate school, grade papers for your students and turn in the grades of the students you had as an instructor. And then 2 weeks later, go in the Army yourself in basic training. And that's kind of what I'm trying to convey there. And then winding up in special training because I was behind physically, what was like for 4 weeks. And then I passed the PC to physical combat proficiency test on I guess it was the fourth try or the fourth week. And then I got to sort of sit around, and I remember talking to a few of the people that were there that had been stuck there for several months. And they really were disabled people that should not have been inducted. And they were basically being put in jail. What amounted to jail for not being competent as men, as the men were expected to be then. That's what it amounted to. And that's kind of the story. This is pretty bad. But that was really going on. I mean, this is when we had a draft and people tried to get out of the draft. I think I talked about the draft physical, what that's like and how personal it is and so forth in places. And we had conscription, we had student deferments then, which went away in 1969 with the lottery when Nixon in December of 1969. But you could get out of you could defer if you were in college and majoring in a math or in a technical chemistry or in a scientific field. If you did get drafted, you got a college education, you were much more likely to not get into a combat unit. But I was in the Pentagon for 3 months and then wound up in Fort Eustis because there was a problem with top secret clearance. And there was some other stuff that went on that's in the books. But that was interesting in itself. So that first story is basically driven from what going through basic training is like. And it's in detail. There have not been very many movies about that really shows what it's really like. Full Metal Jacket, I think it was Oliver Stone, and if I remember right, in 1987, shows it. But there have not been very many films that show what basic training is really like and what it's like to go through it and the shock of it. That ought to be done. Hollywood ought to, and what it was like during the Vietnam War. I mean, that ought to be done better than it's never been done very well.
Okay, in fact, the director of Full Metal Jacket was Stanley Kubrick. I just checked that. So I didn't remember the right one during the interview, but it was Stanley Kubrick. That was the first half of that film. Now remember that this third book that I this third book, just remember that that sort of says as a whole that if you're different and you want to be different, you want to be your own person and live an independent life, you still have to own your own problems and kind of suck up and realize that society might expect you to do some things for the good of others, for the good of your family or lineage or something, that you kind of have to own some of your own problems. There's no mention of gender identity or transgenderism in the third book, in this book, because it was written in 2013 when that topic was just beginning to be noticed a little bit. It wasn't, that wouldn't really be noticed a lot until maybe really not until after the pandemic. It wasn't really that controversial until after the pandemic. But it was it was growing all the time throughout from maybe 2013, 2014 on, until the pandemic and then coming out of the pandemic. So that kind of is another way, whether you think having an identity and fighting for the rights of people that have a certain identity and that they're marginalized as a group, and you're being willing to see yourself as a member of the group, is more important than your rights as an individual, which can be very hard to argue for if you try hard enough to knock them down, which is something I'm working on in the fourth book. I do talk about the fourth book in this interview a little bit at the end. But anyway, I will give you the URL for the complete interview, and it's in my playlist on the professional list videos. And I do encourage you to listen to the whole thing. It's about 53 minutes or so. So that's what I have today, and I do thank you for listening.